Thank you, Gary, and particularly thank you for getting the technology organized, a terrifying thought. I was asked to speak about farming and issues related to farming, and I thought I would talk about the Farm Bill because you just heard from Gary Sposito about how the United States is one of the big three countries that isn't doing anything about these really important ecological problems or isn't doing enough. And I'm going to talk about how our agricultural policy isn't even thinking about these kinds of issues and what a long way we have to go to do something to address these problems, and I'm going to be dealing with that. I'm delighted to be here at Berkeley, in part because of Berkeley's very long agrarian tradition. Those of you who are new students here might not realize that in 1917, when the architect who did the Berkeley campus did Hillgard Hall, he carved into granite the statement, "To rescue for human society the native values of rural life." You might not think of Berkeley as being an agrarian, as having agrarian values, but those are engraved in the history of your campus. I come to this as somebody, I describe myself as a food systems person. I teach in a department that has food studies programs at the undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level, and we have programs in food culture and food systems. And what I mean by food systems is the connection between agriculture, food, nutrition, and public health. When I was studying nutrition and was a master's student here in public health nutrition, and actually even as an undergraduate many years ago, it never occurred to me that agriculture had anything to do with nutrition. I really didn't get it. And it took a long time to realize the importance of agriculture to everything that we do, particularly to public health. Now I think you cannot understand anything about why people eat the way they do without understanding the way our agriculture system works, which brings me to the whole question of the Farm Bill. What is the Farm Bill and why should you care? It seems to me this is a very good question to ask at Berkeley, which is famous for its glorious farmers markets in which people here vote with their fork every time they eat, and in which you just won an outstanding victory in getting a tax on big soda. Congratulations, we're all very envious of you. Well, I asked the same question a few years ago. Why would anybody need to know anything about the Farm Bill, which makes eyes glaze over just to think about it? And in 2008, when we were working on the previous Farm Bill, I thought, I don't know enough about the Farm Bill. What better way to learn about the Farm Bill than to teach a course in it? What was I thinking? So on the first day of class, I asked my poor innocent students what they thought an ideal agricultural policy would be. And this is what they came up with on day one. And you can see whether you can think of anything that you might want to add to this. An ideal agricultural policy, if you were going to start from scratch, would first of all feed the country. It would provide an adequate food intake for everybody and at a price that everybody could afford. It would pay the farmers who were growing it enough money so that they made a decent living, and it would do the same for the agricultural workers who were picking the crops and working in the food system. It would promote all the things we in Berkeley love: local, regional, organic, and sustainable food systems. It would promote fruits and vegetables, because that's what everybody ought to be eating for health. And on a global level, it would promote fair trade and reasonable food aid that would empower countries that needed food aid to eventually get on their feet and take care of their own food. It would protect the natural resources that we just heard about: air, water, soil, and it would promote animal welfare while we were raising animals to eat them. And at the same time, it would prevent climate change, it would prevent pollution, all of that, those dead zones that you heard about from Gary, and it would prevent unnecessary waste, which you also just heard about. That's the ideal. Pretty impressive, huh? That was on the first day. And I thought, well, this will be easy. And then we got to the Farm Bill. And the current Farm Bill is the Agricultural Act of 2014. It was just passed a few months ago, known in the trade as the Farm Bill. It is 357 pages of very, very small, indecipherable type. Its table of contents is 10 pages long and goes on and on and on. It costs taxpayers about $100 billion a year. That's real money. And I'm going to say rather bluntly, it's visionless. It has no vision whatsoever. And every single word of it is mired in politics. Very, very disappointing to try to read about, to understand it, and to think about what you would have to do to make it better. Even President Obama, when the bill passed, when asked to comment on agricultural policy, said, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It's got all these things that it does, and I would say it doesn't do any of them really well. You know, it's great to have it if you need it in a hurry, but if you want to really do things, you need real tools. You need real tools to deal with agricultural infrastructure, with conservation, how important that is, with doing something about jobs, and with doing everything on the list of the ideal components of an agricultural policy. So here we are with something like that, and the Farm Bill itself is divided into what are called titles. We're now going to do Washington speak. Washington speak puts bills in titles. That just means sections. And there are 12 sections in the Agricultural Act of 2014. Only 3 of them deal with farms. Those are the commodity programs, the credit programs, and the crop insurance. Those are part of the safety net for farmers. Everything else has to do with everything else that the Farm Bill deals with. Conservation is in there, but most people would argue not nearly enough. Trade is in there, but nobody's very happy with the way those provisions come out. Nutrition is a big part of it. I'll talk about that. Rural development means broadband. That's really what it's about. It doesn't really mean what you would think about if you go into the Midwest and see these towns that are completely boarded up. It's not doing anything about that kind of rural development. Research, fine. Forestry, fine. Energy means biofuels. That's what that means, turning corn into ethanol. Horticulture also needs translation. Horticulture refers to fruits and vegetables, specialty crops in agri-speak. And miscellaneous is miscellaneous. We don't have to go into it, but a lot of it has to do with financial issues and other kinds of things. So a very, very peculiar kind of collection of things in a very, very large bill. And I would say, again, bluntly, because I don't know how else to say it, that the Farm Bill is so big. It has so many programs, literally hundreds of programs, each with its own acronym and its own collection of lobbyists. It is so complicated and so confusing in its priorities that only a lobbyist can understand it. Somebody who is paid to understand the section of the Farm Bill that somebody has hired the lobbyist to can understand it, and therefore it is totally undemocratic because no normal mortal can understand this thing. Certainly not in its entirety, and I would have to say that no legislator can understand it either, and even the legislators on the Agricultural Committee only understand what's going on because they have people on their staff who have made it their business over the years to try to understand the different provisions of the bill. My class found this very unsatisfactory. They were extraordinarily distressed every time I said, nobody can understand this thing, because they felt that professors ought to be able to explain everything. And I'm afraid I could not explain a lot of this except in the details. Now, we have to ask the question, how did we get to this? how did this happen? How did we get a piece of legislation that is so far from ideal as to not even approach it or address the same issues? Well, for that, you have to go back in ancient history to the Great Depression of the 1930s, when farmers were growing crops, but the public didn't have enough money to buy them. Nobody had money. And so farmers would grow the crops would be destroyed, they would pour oil all over them, so they didn't go on the market and were given away for free. There was a horrible incident in which huge numbers of baby pigs were destroyed because nobody had the money to buy them. And that convinced Congress to do something to try to set up some kind of system that would support farmers so that they could continue to grow food. And that was the beginning of the farm bills and the agricultural support system that we now have now. Now, in the beginning, the agricultural supports, which were a system of very complicated loans, price supports, acreage limits, those are now gone, but in the beginning they were there, and then marketing supports. Those were meant to be emergency measures, just to get the farmers through the Depression. But in fact, these measures encouraged farms to become larger. And the larger farms began to look at these different kinds of support systems as entitlements rather than emergency measures. And there soon built up an interesting and very complicated triumvirate that ran agricultural policy. And the triumvirate included agribusiness, represented in this slide by Cargill, the Department of Agriculture, and congressional agriculture committees. And these three units worked together so closely to promote an agricultural system that favored large agriculture over small, and that promoted price supports and all of these other kinds of supports for big agriculture, that it became a system that was absolutely inviolable and you couldn't touch it. And the best example of that is Jamie Whitten, who was elected to the House of Representatives in the late 1940s.